first 2 episodes of Joss Whedon's The Nevers has debuted on HBO, so let's talk about it. So The Nevers is the latest show from Joss Whedon, and it is on HBO. It tells a story right around the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century in London, where 3 years earlier an event occurred which caused people to start having superpowers, or they call their turn. And therefore the show is about this orphanage for women who have these powers, who are trying to figure out what happened, help people in need, and then there's people in power that don't like what's taking place. So it's a little bit like X-Men, it's a little bit steampunk, and it's got some of that Joss Whedon dialogue to it. With that said, go ahead and join me down below in the comment section. Let me know, have you checked out The Nevers, and what did you think about it? Let's keep this spoiler-free, so if you want to talk about something specific, just put up a spoiler warning first, but I'm going to try and stay spoiler-free in my discussion of the show for people trying to decide if they want to check it out. Now, if you're not familiar with the backstory on this show, it's a little bit interesting. Going back about 3 or 4 years before all the scandal started with Joss Whedon, he had this idea for The Nevers and was shopping it around to multiple different networks who were interested in it. HBO ended up being the one that purchased it, and they basically went straight to series. They loved what he was doing, told him to go for it. Joss Whedon did a whole bunch of TV shows from the late 90s all the way through Dollhouse, and I'm a big fan of his television work. Of course, I love his work with the MCU as well. And so when they announced they were working on a new Joss Whedon project, I was naturally very interested in it, especially because it was on HBO. All of his previous work had been on network television. So I was wondering, like, what can he do with modern technology without the constraints of network television and with all the freedom and production values that come with HBO? So I was naturally very interested in it. And then, of course, over the last year, there have just been report after report after report after report of Joss Whedon's bad behavior on sets over the last 20 years. And it's kind of tainted this project because it just makes Joss Whedon look like such a horrible person, while there's this thing that a lot of different people were working on. So after the show was written, shot, and everything, he dropped out of the project, I believe, like back in October, November of last year, even though it basically was already finished. But he dropped out of the show because there was kind of so much surrounding him. He said it was just because of the stress of 2020, but I'm sure it was all this other stuff surrounding him. And it's created a bit of an interesting situation with the show where, as they went into marketing it, they didn't mention Joss Whedon's name at all. They purchased it because it was Joss Whedon. He wrote, directed, created, executive produced the first episode, but they did everything in their power to kind of hide his involvement in it. And so my wife, who saw the trailer, was just interested in it. She didn't even realize he was involved until we finished the first episode. And then it was like, Joss Whedon directed it, Joss Whedon created, Joss Whedon executive producer. Like, everything was him. And they do, on HBO, they kind of do the after the show where they do this behind the scenes deal. He's not anywhere involved in it. And there's one point in time where he's talking in the background and the subtitles label him just as the director, but they did everything they could to not acknowledge him because there's just so much bad press surrounding him right now. So anyway, that's the backstory on the show, as well as a little bit my backstory with Joss Whedon. I really enjoy his previous work on television, so I was naturally interested in this and wanted to check it out. What were my general impressions of the first 2 episodes? And in general, pretty lukewarm and mixed on this one. It's not devoid of positive elements, but it also felt like a very odd mix of a bunch of different things. On the positive side of things, it might be the best directed thing that Joss Whedon has done. He wrote the first episode, didn't write the second episode, but he did direct both episodes. And I mean, the show has HBO production values and that kind of prestige vibe to it, even though it is about people with superpowers and has characters with a little bit of the Joss Whedon snark to it. But it has this kind of prestige vibe to the way that it's presented and the production values and everything. And You see that in the way that Joss Whedon directed these first 2 episodes. To that point, as I keep mentioning, the production values are kind of top notch here. Everything looks great. Everything looks crisp and sharp, and the special effects are all convincing and fit inside the universe while having a flair to them and a style to them. All those sorts of things that you want in a show like this. But as you go into it, the comparison that almost everyone is making is that it feels like just X-Men set in London 125 years ago. The nature of characters having abilities, there's an orphanage that's very reminiscent of Charles Xavier's School for the Gifted, and then the themes and kind of subtext and everything, very reminiscent of the same exact stuff that X-Men was tackling 50 years ago about using these people with powers as a mechanism to comment on the patriarchy, prejudice, racism, like all of that stuff that X-Men has been doing a long, long time. Same exact kind of vibe. So it's just kind of felt familiar, different setting, but very reminiscent of the X-Men. And then kind of going into it, as I mentioned before, I was kind of excited to see what would Joss Whedon do without the constraints of network television and the requirements of it and the restrictions. And the show, while has the production value of HBO, the nature of the show felt like network television. You could imagine this show being on any network, any mainstream network, just if they had to trim out the rated R stuff. You could easily see that version of it, to the extent that at times it felt a little bit like they had a show that he had written, designed to be for anyone, and then HBO was like, hey, we're HBO, you got to throw some boobs in there. You got to throw some F-bombs. Like they felt kind of unnaturally squeezed in there a little bit. And so, like I said, there's things I enjoyed about it. Like I was intrigued enough to want to check out the second episode, and I'll check it out again next week. But I didn't feel like it fully came together. Everything felt a bit too familiar, whether feeling like X-Men, feeling like network television, even though it's on HBO. And though it has kind of this steampunk vibe on skin on top of it, it doesn't feel different enough in its own way. It's just kind of, it's even almost difficult to pinpoint exactly what it is that feels off about it. But from even its kind of messaging feels very on the nose, but familiar. It's not saying something new that hasn't been said by other shows or by X-Men before. It's saying the same sorts of things about the white man in power that sees the world as in harmony right now. And he's just overtly stating kind of very cliche tropes of the patriarchy and things like that. So it just, like, I appreciate things it's doing, but it certainly wasn't living up to my expectations and hopes for it. It can feel very heavy-handed, very familiar too. So pretty disappointed by the first 2 episodes and kind of what we got out of it, but not so much so that I'm not going to keep watching. There's just enough there that I'm going to keep watching to see if it does improve. Historically, Joss Whedon shows take a little while to get going. Buffy the Vampire Slayer season 1, I'd say it's probably the worst season of the show. The beginning of the show, Angel, is wildly different from what the rest of the seasons did. The first 6 or 7 episodes of Dollhouse, like totally different from what the show turns into when there's like a turn around 6 or 7, and then they start doing something totally different with the concept of the show. And so historically, it does take Whedon shows frequently a while to find traction and get going properly. So that also kind of gives me some hope. But there's the other side to it of just with all the backstory of Whedon that you kind of go, do I even want to give it the benefit of the doubt? But then I also go, everyone else worked on the show too, so I don't want to punish them just because it seems like he's kind of a jerk. So I'm kind of torn on all sorts of levels with this one. As of right now, I plan to keep on watching to figure out if does it kind of find its vibe a little better. I thought the second episode was a little bit better than the first because you could see it. You could feel a little bit better what the show's looking to do with the different episodes and the relationships coming together. Certainly felt very much like network television in the way the show was designed, except with the R-rated stuff squished in. I was talking with my wife afterwards, and I was like, yeah, the language, it just feels like doesn't feel like an adult show where adults are talking like adults. It feels like a 13-year-old trying to talk like an adult. It feels forced in there. Same with when they go to a sex club. It feels forced in there. And so, I don't know. It was frustrating. Pretty frustrating. Mildly intriguing. Mildly entertaining. There's just enough in there to keep me hanging out hope that maybe it'll get better, but certainly did not wow me right out of the gate or just hook me right out of the gate. Wish I could have been more excited about this one. There was so much potential. The idea of what could Joss Whedon do without the constraints of mainstream television. Years to develop the show, and then it's like, okay, it's not as interesting as I thought it would be. Not as different as I thought it would be. Let me know what you thought down below in the comment section. If you want to talk about specifics, go ahead and just put a spoiler warning just in case people are haven't checked out the show yet and they're just deciding if they want to check it out. Thank you guys so much for watching, and keep talking movies and TV too much.